Hi everyone, my name's Nicole and I'll be hosting the webinar for you today. Thank you so much for joining Microsoft Azure experts Mark Lomas and David Cox for the final Azure webinar in this event series. October has been programmed Exploring Azure Cloud Webinar Month, and today's webinar topic is Securing Your Journey to the Cloud. This Microsoft-led session investigates how Microsoft's competitive advantage in cloud security can leverage Azure features to strengthen your security posture. Including identity and device management, we will also examine the 3 critical points for safeguarding your business against external threats and leaks, and explain what your 5-point digital defense strategy should be. For those organizations interested in achieving a modern, agile, and secure way of working, Mark and David's session focuses on how to protect employees from cyber threat, the steps to take to safeguard your confidential data, and the importance of securing your most valuable asset. Before we start, I'd like to let you know that if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to write them down in the Q&A tab in the top right corner, and we'll answer them after the presentation. Thank you. I would like to introduce our 2 speakers today, Mark Lomas and David Cox, both of whom are seasoned Microsoft Azure experts. So I'll now hand you over to David Cox, who will start us off with our Securing Your Journey to the Cloud presentation. So over to you, Dave.
Morning, everybody. Hope you're doing well, and thank you for joining us for this 3rd session. I'm just going to share my slides and we can begin. Superb. Okay, so intentions this morning, I'm going to be covering quite a bit of ground. That's even before Mark starts his piece. And my hope is that we can plant some seeds, help you perhaps identify some areas that require further input. I suppose it's hardly an understatement. It's there's an awful lot to be. There's a lot of plates we're juggling when we're looking at security, particularly in this current climate. And I appreciate that. I'm not going to go too doom and gloom. You often do hear that in webinars of this type. But actually, my intention is to, on a high level, explore some of the areas that we ought to be focusing on, pass over for Mark's piece where he goes into a bit more depth, and hopefully kind of build a bit of a foundation so that you can continue that productive dialogue with the team at ProBrand. So, yeah, we're going to look at what challenge are we solving, some steps I think every business should be taking, and also like how Microsoft are helping. You know, what are they doing in this space to make your lives a little bit easier? So, I suppose as you all appeared today, you're probably quite aware of some of the challenges, but this expansive digital estate is such a logistical nightmare for all of us. For those of you that joined us for the first 2 sessions, we acknowledge the quality of life improvement for a lot of people that are, able to leverage hybrid working in some degree. But I also joked that it was probably causing a bit some long nights for those of us that are actually responsible for keeping those users, their devices, their data secure. And we're not really looking at, it's a different topology. Everything's different now. We're not defending a ring fencing a local network, and we got third-party applications. Some people are utilizing multi-cloud. Many of us still have some of our hardware, whether it's our domain controllers or some of our older storage is still on premise. So we've got our data just about everywhere, and it makes this harder to like visualize the picture in your head, or it certainly does for me. And another challenge is the sheer volume, variety, and just like complexity of the data that we're being bombarded with, that we have to analyze, that we're trying to detect patterns if we're looking at potential actions from bad actors. We're trying to keep all our users safe. We're having to contend with user error. And we did talk about this in our last session, that to an extent, we can't eliminate user error. We can improve their hygiene and common sense and all the rest of it, but it's going to happen. But one thing we can do is enforce policies and the like, so that we're doing our best to make it much harder for them to inadvertently stumble into something they shouldn't. But the challenge we have is, these data scientists and all those sort of cool job titles some people have. These are expensive resources, and it's not always or often, unless we're an enterprise, it's not really realistic to have someone like that on site. And that's why one of the services I'm going to touch on today, Azure Sentinel, is a really good service that if you haven't got a robust SIEM solution already in place, it might be a starting point for that conversation with the team at Probrand. And like I kind of alluded to a few slides back, things are just getting way more complex. We're dealing with a device as the new endpoint, and people are bringing their own devices. Sometimes it will be corporate devices. You'll have users that are on multiple devices. Yeah, they'll have their office device, or if they're external, perhaps a Surface, but there'll be days where people turn up or are traveling and they've either forgotten or are using another. So you might have some people might have a work mobile and a personal mobile, a work device and a home laptop. I mean, that's exactly what the situation I'm in. I use two mobiles and two laptops interchangeably, depending where I am and what I'm doing. It's all enrolled in the we've got it all appropriately enrolled from a business point of view, but obviously it's a lot of faff. It's something we have to be quite organized to do. Yeah, this is a busy slide, and it's kind of intentional, just to kind of highlight the fact that I do understand there's lots to us for us to be mindful of. And one thing that some of you may be aware of, and perhaps some aren't. Often these sort of issues start with a compromised account. That usually is how they'll leverage compromised user credentials. That will give them access. They'll be exfiltrating data for as long as they think they can get away with it. Possibly even playing with rogue applications. And I suppose the three on the right, at least the way I've always seen this, I'm usually more cognizant of this stuff. Like the internal, when the relationship goes sour and someone leaves the business, like locking down data, using Intune to wipe corporate data from a personal device. For me, at least, this is something that's always been my favorite feature of Intune, and I've always had that banked in my head. But some of the stuff on the left is a little bit more I at least think about less, and there'll be some of you that it'll be perhaps the opposite. But there's, as you can see, there's quite a lot of different things we need to be juggling in our head, and it's I'm not even sure whether this particular stat was Gartner or Microsoft. I've got a few from both in here, but yeah, and perhaps that's part of the reason some of you have come on today. It is causing sleepless nights, a lot, some anxiety around trying to juggle all these things. We're seeing massive high-profile businesses, whether it was Rockstar or Uber, like Mark referenced in one of our previous sessions. Whether it's brute force attacks on MFA or things of that nature. I appreciate there's a lot to defend against. And taking my point about data a bit further, most organizations are reporting an increase in the volume of data, a bit like the slide I had earlier on, which makes sense because we're all seeing just more of it. But what's interesting is look how little of it, 44% of alerts are not investigated. And I don't think that's because people are blasé about it, far from it. I think the problem is alert fatigue. People don't have latent capacity, in their teams. I'm sure many of you are wearing many hats, so you're not going to have latent capacity to have someone sit there and analyze that data 24/7, which again is where something like a Sentinel solution that's managed by the Katuic program, that could be something that could help pick up some of that slack here. Threat sophistication is changing all the damn time. So and with traditional SIEM solutions, even if someone has one, there's often a lack of automation, and they're not usually that good at how would I say it? Sort of analyzing data from different data points, particularly if it's like cloud-based, which is something Sentinel is very well equipped to do. It's good with multi-cloud. It's good with ingesting on-prem. The signals come from on-prem as well as in the cloud. It's a good way of basically managing from cloud, which anyone who saw the Microsoft's pivot at Inspire, you'll have seen their messaging changed a little. They're now, being a bit more pragmatic, acknowledging that many organizations aren't going to move fully into the cloud. But so their best bet is making sure they're utilizing it in some way. And we're going to see more and more, I think, solutions and software that Microsoft are pushing out to enable people to manage from cloud or secure perimeters from there, even if some of their workloads remain on premise. So yeah, a little bit around that. And yeah, okay, the sort of slightly more ominous slide. There's always a slide like this in every security deck, right? But we're looking at this from a small business context. So try to forgive me because I have got a point. It's not just, oh, this is bleak. Unfortunately, about 70% of attacks are aimed at small businesses. These guys are opportunistic, a bit like burglars. You're probably more likely to, drive. I say you as if I'm doing a webinar for burglary, but I imagine would be more likely to drive through the suburbs and look for a house with the back gate open rather than just going for a gated house with video cameras because you're hoping the grand piano's worth the risk. It's not really how these people think. And we saw a massive uptick in the pandemic of people targeting smaller organizations. Their assumption is that they have smaller budgets. Even if they're aware of the challenges, they haven't got solutions in place, and that it's going to be more lucrative for them. We can see there how many devices are compromised every month, which is a bit daunting, especially when I admitted I use 4 for my work, and I imagine many of you do as well. So it's not, now we've got 4 points of failure, haven't we? Sadly, 60% of small businesses have to close doors after an attack because the average cost is like basically a million. It's a lot. So it's not the kind of cost that many of us can absorb without significant problems. And unfortunately, that's why we have to look at this stuff. I think Mark actually talked about this, but I've had conversations since in the office. It's blurring in my head, but the Uber thing, right? You saw on LinkedIn how many like security posts they started advertising for after the breach. So it's that age-old saying, right? Like people worry about this stuff after it happens. Yeah, and it's weird how little time it can take attackers to get in, a matter of minutes, but it can take 99 days to realize there's been a breach. I remember when Azure Sentinel first released, like well over a year ago now, but the first customer I was talking to about it, they were paying for an enterprise SIEM solution that was a lot more expensive, but that's not the interesting bit. They were paying for this tooling, but they had a breach and they didn't realize it wasn't actually 99 days in this case, it was 60 odd. But suffice to say, they were angry. They gave Sentinel a go, had a much better experience, but they're still using it. So nearly 2 years later. And it was much, much cheaper, much more cost effective as a solution as well. So yeah, I think that's the thing. We don't want to be waiting 50 plus days to realize there's been a problem, because how far will have they spread in the network, how many accounts, devices, and yeah, it's not what we want. Yeah, the other challenge, of course, 10% click on with the phishing stuff. Yeah, we can do like phishing awareness and hygiene, and we can also there are things that can be done there, but it is a challenge. Weak passwords, that's another one. With Intune and the like, you might have policies that enforce variant passwords, or you might have single sign-on, but with encrypted. There's so many different ways we could do this. There's arguably pros and cons to many of the ways, and that's why, forgive me, some of this has to be general because there's so many moving parts, and all of you will have a different situation. But my hope is by touching on this stuff at a high level, it will give you hopefully plant a seed that kind of warrants a follow-up with Mark and the pre-sales team. That's an interesting one as well about accidentally sharing information. The palm on forehead moment when we realized. And yeah, these are some of the areas we need to be thinking about. I've kind of talked about user credentials already, but that's massive. It's really worth noting as well, compliance standards, you don't get let off the hook if we're a smaller organization. Depending what vertical we're in, some of our compliance standards might be more or less rigorous, yeah, legal or financial or something. But from a data point of view and all these sorts of things, a lot of it's universal. So we have to be aware of that. Perhaps one of your biggest challenges you're all thinking about is the conundrum around remote productivity. We've got a bit of a paradox there where one extreme would be we basically prohibit use of cloud for security concerns, which means people basically can't do squat when they're working at home, like the people that got caught out during the pandemic and had to double up on expenditure. But perhaps the other extreme was we're like, power to the people, give them, give them every flavor of software and cloud that we can, but there's no real protection for the data, the devices. We haven't got a clear vision and visualization of the network and the moving parts. So yeah, I'm not being facetious, but I'm trying to point out the two extremes that we don't want either of those, right? We probably need to review our perhaps antivirus and anti-spam stuff. And that's one thing as well. Obviously, I'm here singing the virtue of Microsoft, and I think their solutions have a strong place in more or less any organization's approach. But at the same time, I think there are areas where other vendors do bring like quality third-party stuff. And I'm sure when you're having that dialogue with the team, Microsoft might sort of be the linchpin, perhaps as it should be for much of this, but there are going to be other options and other complementary services we can bring in. I wanted to say that as well, because I've noticed as well when I hear people talk about security, WatchGuard, Barracuda, whoever, there's always this sense of buy this product and you're sorted. I don't really see it that way. I think it's more important talking about the challenges and then thinking about how we're going to fill in those gaps. I do happen to think that often we can the bulk of that solution might revolve around Microsoft, but just about every customer I work with has like a variety of components as well. So I don't know, just wanted to give that that transparency there, because I'm sure that's all of you will probably be in some degree of that sort of situation. We need to think about non-sanctioned user apps. I use Tidal for my music streaming, but every now and again I have to kind of justify that, or it gets queried as an app. But we want these sort of things in place. I mean, we're probably, you have to think about your risk tolerance, but there'll be some apps that you're going to be a lot more concerned about than others. So perhaps some of the negativity out of the way. What are Microsoft doing to help? Staggering investment, $1 billion a year. They have the funds, but it's an awful lot. We talked about shared responsibility some time ago, how ultimately it's Microsoft's credibility on the line. If they had a appreciable breach of their platform, it would be a nightmare for them. And the Exchange breach that you hear about, of course, that was not Exchange Online. That was like legacy versions. And so much of their innovation is being pointed towards their cloud products and things that are coming out in that space that to an extent, whatever our preference might be, it almost is making it become almost like a mandatory consideration, because that's where all the investment and extended support for operating systems and software is being shifted. So, yeah, they're very conscious. They're very dominant in the security sort of Gartner Magic Quadrants, which is nice to see. And because of the 24 trillion signals collected daily, the sort of the AI features, the SOAR features they call it, of things, tools like Sentinel that detect patterns and things like that, they're dealing with trillions. It's such a unfathomable amount of data coming in, and that's why it can be useful. Because you're getting to piggyback off of all of that data ingestion from other people in the market for some of what, once it's monitored and configured correctly by the team, they can have certain policies and runs in place so that, it can really do some really smart stuff with this, which is really, really cool to see. And for those that, I think I covered this in one of the previous webinars, but we've got more attendees today, which is wonderful. But just generally, again, there is that sort of division of labor when it comes to shared responsibility. Yes, the provider's responsibility is the platform, and that's part of the reason they spend so much securing it, keeping their name in the clear. But we need to be thinking about our endpoints, how people are connecting, and all of this stuff as well. I haven't really talked about like network security and stuff yet, because there's so much to cover in this brief webinar. But my hope is that it will hopefully spur some further conversations with the pre-sales team. So what perhaps should a business be doing? And some of this you will already, but we probably want to be shifting towards a zero trust approach. Yeah. Protecting our assets, our devices, our users with central policy. And I suspect many of you are shifting in that direction, but it might have been it's not an overnight switch from the classic approach. And perhaps many of you, certainly till perhaps 2 years ago, were perhaps not looking at that. So maybe that's a journey you're part of the way through. And fair play, because um, despite how sanctimonious sometimes people, perhaps even I, sound delivering this kind of messaging, I think most organisations, if we're a fly on the wall, they're some, if at best, most of the way through this journey, this change, this transition. We've all got to be real about this stuff, but even so, it is a journey we have to be taking. So zero trust is the way. Always verify, like never assume. There we go. So explicitly verify identity of devices, location, perhaps device health, detecting anomalies and sort of questioning those in real time. And also like level of access, whether it's just in time, just enough access, conditional access on SharePoint. There's an awful lot in that space actually that we can do to kind of mitigate risk. But even I'll say it, it's busy work. Yeah, it's faff, and it can be a lot. There's a lot to think about there, which again is probably why it's worth having that dialogue with the team to make it a bit more bearable to get that done. And then assumption around breach, and thinking about preventing lateral movement, and all these sorts of things. I know it's a lot to be thinking about, and I'm sure that if everyone listening, some of this you'll have smashed, and good for you. But there'll be a few areas perhaps where we can always improve. So we want to protect our data, we want to control access as best we can, and we also need to be monitoring activity too. Doing our best to protect against data leaks and exfiltrations rather, and just like the levels of access control as well. So something that I think is interesting as well, 91% of attacks start with a phishing email, and 10% of users click on those. So it's obviously an important area for us to have solutions and policies around that we can, around inbox protection against spam and virus, best to block phishing attacks as well, and the operating system people are using, whether that's 10, 11, hopefully not further back, but I know there will be scenarios where people are, perhaps because of legacy applications. And I talked about in previous sessions how we can move those applications into Azure. We can roll them back to previous operating systems, and it means that you get extended security support without paying for it. So that could be a bit of a lifeline, a carrot for some people listening. But there could be some of you that, despite that, still have a requirement to keep some of those applications and client OS and everything on legacy versions. So that almost makes this stuff even more imperative that we've got strong stuff supporting us in the absence of that. And with data leaking, we can restrict the copying and sharing of business information. Thinking about unauthorized users, and if we've got external people coming in for project work and stuff, how are we going to onboard those users? How are we monitoring their activity and things like that? Encryption of mobile devices, like that Intune feature I talked about with people leaving the business. Basically the same feature we can use to wipe data on lost or stolen devices, providing people report them, and having like robust backup policy in place for our mailboxes. So lots to think about there as well, which is interesting, looking at how respondees feel about outdated security controls on their environment, and then the cost incurred for stolen records is not great either. We need to think about like who has access to what, letting the right people in, being aware of who has access to what data within the organization, making sure people are being sensible with their credentials, enforcing that they change regularly as well. Yeah, quarantining compromised devices, that's another thing. And some of you hear that and think that sounds cool, but how do we do that? Like, realistically, effectively, and rapidly. That's another follow-up conversation. And preventing non-compliant devices from accessing as well. We need to have policy in place, whether it's around kind of non apps we're not happy with or whatever. We need to challenge. We need to challenge those devices rather than kind of, oh, go on, letting it through. Man, 3 or 4 passwords. And to be honest, I think that's being generous. I think we all know people with like 1 or 2 for their personal, let alone their work stuff. 1 or 2 universal passwords. And then we have almost like a 5-point strategy, which it just signposts you to a few areas, right? We want to strengthen that control, implementing MFA. I think I've talked loads about access and conditional. I don't think I've actually talked about MFA yet today. Of course, Mark did when we talked about the Uber breach with that kind of brute force attack where eventually they were let in. And I think Mark was talking about how there's been changes. I've been talking to people in education where, oh no, that was around backup, sorry. My head's gone blurred. It's still early on a Monday. But for anyone who is in education, the requirements for 3 copies of backup, that's an interesting change. But back to MFA, yeah, the goalposts are moving around that. What sort of satisfactory levels of protection there? Talked about zero trust. I won't go on about that again. Secure Score's cool. So with Cloud Defender, which is an Azure tool that the team can roll out for you, it doesn't come with a large cost, but what's cool about it is it will give you a general secure score, and it's good because it gives you actionable points. Just hearing me talk about all this stuff, it's there'll be hopefully some nuggets of interest, but ultimately you'll leave thinking, okay, well, how do we take this forward? The secure score stuff is always a nice starting point, I feel. It lets you realize where the gaps are in your defense. Classifying and labeling our resources is always a good thing, and seeing as I'm on the Azure side, I think it's always best practice for like billing queries and stuff. Whenever you need to query a resource cost or bill with the program team, and while we'll be supporting that, it usually makes our jobs a lot easier when resources are classified in that way. And it also helps you keep control of budgeting, right? If you've got multiple teams within the organization, you've got some developers, you've got production workloads and whatnot. It does make sense not just to have multiple Azure subscriptions for those environments, but also to kind of classify and label the groups of resources. Yeah, so you can see here the Siemens source stuff. The good thing there is basically Sentinel will get you covered on both of those. It's a really cool tool. If you do end up looking at doing some kind of proof of concept with the team around some workloads, you could always have Sentinel as part of that solution. Have ingestion from your on-premise apps, your third-party ones, and see what you make of it. One big change you'll probably find if you've got an on-premise SIEM tool is that you don't pay infrastructure costs on Sentinel. So what I mean, the challenge with an on-premise SIEM solution is as we've acknowledged earlier, right, we're dealing with more and more data. And if we're ingesting that data and retaining it for any appreciable time so that we can actually do proper stuff with it and detect patterns or, multiple attempted breaches or whatever, we're basically ending up with more and more data. And we need larger physical footprints to contend with that. Which means growing and growing costs. Luckily, with this solution, Microsoft front that particular cost. You do have data storage and retention costs, a bit like with backup, but it will be much, much, much less than a comparative solution. So not only is it very good at dealing with signals and data from multi-cloud and coping with on-premise workloads. The other cool feature is ingestion of apps that you've already purchased, like from a 365 perspective. Many of you are already utilizing your 365 through these guys and EMS features and stuff. Ingestion of pretty much everything, bar Active Directory. Don't ask me why, it's just Microsoft quirks. It's never simple, is it? But basically every app, bar Active Directory, you don't have ingestion costs. They reward your investment into the stack, which is pretty cool. So yeah, touched on a few of these in a bit of detail. I'm mindful I want to give Mark plenty of time to talk about his piece, so I'm going to move forward. But these are some of the main things to be looking at. Defender for 365 or business. I swear they've changed the name of that. I can't even keep up with it. But that is brilliant. It's included in Business Premium. I think it's even included in Business Standard. Mark, when you get your bit, like confirm either way. I can't quite remember, but I think it is Business Standard that's included in, which is really nice. And I swear there's a weird thing where you get it in the business plans, but you don't get it in enterprise unless you get a standalone, which is strange. And then Defender for Cloud, which was the thing you might remember I was talking about that gives you the secure score. That's a great tool to get the team to roll out for you. And finally, Sentinel. Sentinel is it's brilliant. We've seen a lot of uptake over the last couple of years. I'd say outside of Azure Virtual Desktop, which is like my favorite thing since sliced bread, this is probably there's the most buzz around this particular service in Azure, and I think for good reason. It's not prohibitively expensive, and it's pretty smart. So I think it's over to Mark now. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, and yeah, I'll be back for the Q&A towards the end.
Thank you very much for that, Dave. I'll just get my screen shared here.
Great.
You see that okay?
I've got it. Yep.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you very much for that, Dave. My name is Mark Lomas, Cloud Architect here at ProBrand. I'm going to take you through a few of the ways that we can assist on helping you on your cloud journey, and a few of the ways that we can help with some security advice and security recommendations. I'm going to be exploring a few additional areas here and expand on some of the points that Dave was mentioning there. Just for a reminder for those of you who've joined, there is going to be a Q&A at the end of this. So if you do think of any questions, feel free to pop them in the Q&A section up at the top, and we'll try and address those towards the end for you. Obviously, when you were talking about cybersecurity, there are a number of areas that we'll probably all be fairly used to and familiar with, the sort of basics of cybersecurity that we might have addressed in the past. You know, you might have been looking at things like making sure that you've got good antivirus deployed, that you've got a good firewall in place, that you've got your patch management sorted, cover a few bases like that, and you've kind of got a lot of the bases covered, right? But of course, cybersecurity is an ever-evolving picture, and there are a few new areas these days. Well, maybe not so much new these days, but certainly additional areas that we would want to put into that pot of what we consider the basics of cybersecurity. Things like identity management, for example. So this is obviously where we're talking about our usernames and passwords, our accounts for logging into our environment in the first place. And of course, there are various aspects of this that we might be fairly familiar with already. So, you know, things like multi-factor authentication. Dave was mentioning that in his slide deck there. You know, even if you haven't implemented multi-factor authentication yet in your estate, chances are you will have come across it in your daily life anyway. You know, whenever you log on to something like an online bank, you are often challenged for more than just a password or PIN number. You'll have to put in some additional factor as well. You might be sent a text message. You might have one of those PIN pads that you have to put your card into to authorize certain actions. These are all examples of multi-factor authentication. And it's fast becoming, if not really already, you know, just the basics. It's just locking the front door when you leave. This is now just what you have to do to make sure that security is in place. So multi-factor authentication pretty much now considered to be an essential, a must-have in order to enable good protection around your user accounts and passwords. It's just far too easy for hackers to brute force or steal a password or guess a password or research what a user's password might be in order to gain access to their account. Single sign-on, also another good thing to implement in your organization. This is going to make it not just easier for users to be signing in, it's also going to potentially improve authentication security for all of your services. If you use one service to protect all of your logins to all of your IT services, whether they be in the cloud, whether they be on premises, third-party solutions, if you're wrapping it all up so that there is one gatekeeper to gain access to all of those services, then first of all, you've only got one password to remember. So hopefully you've got a better chance of convincing people to use a secure password. But also you can then also be wrapping those services up with the same multi-factor authentication solution so that we're protecting all of our services, not just one or some of those services. Single sign-on, quite useful there to do that. Conditional access rules can also be another good way to help improve security. This is where we start to add in some additional rules into the picture. You know, the kind of rules that we're used to. Do you have the right password? Have you passed multi-factor authentication? Well, we can extend them. Are you in an expected location? Are you signing in from a secure device? Is the sign-in that we're seeing risky in some way? What does it mean by risky? Well, you know, you could be, for example, looking for some inviolable rules. You know, if we see a sign-in attempt that is successful from a user and that appears to be in Birmingham, but then 5 minutes later, the same user account is presenting the same username and password in New York. Well, that's obviously impossible. The user couldn't make that journey that quickly. The system can be intelligent enough to figure these things out and say, well, hang on, that's not possible. We're not going to let that in. We're going to flag that as a risky sign-in. So we can do certain things to add additional rules to reduce the likelihood, reduce the risk profile, make it harder. You know, that's one of the things that we're looking to do here. We don't want to make it easy for hackers. We want to make it harder. We want to put them in a position where, you know, if they're just trying the door handle, they'll find it locked and move on. That's what we're looking for. We don't want to leave the door unlocked. We certainly don't want to leave it open. These are the sort of things that we're trying to do here. But of course, as again Dave was mentioning there, the nature of the threat evolves. He used the example of the Uber hack that happened a few weeks ago. Well, that's an example of multi-factor authentication fatigue. You know, what happens when you try and sign in? Well, you get a prompt on your phone potentially saying, do you accept or deny? Is this you? Do you accept this login attempt? You might get a code, you might get some other form of prompt, but a lot of organizations and a lot of vendors have implemented multi-factor authentication that's just a prompt on your phone that you can accept to make it as easy as possible. But the hackers with the Uber attack, they exploited in the nature of what's called a multi-factor authentication fatigue attack, where they managed to get people's passwords. They knew that they would have to get past multi-factor, but they just kept submitting logins until eventually somebody pressed accept, and that's how they got in. And then they used that exploited login as a springboard to gain access to more stuff inside Uber. So this is the kind of attack that they were able to execute to try and get around multi-factor. And I think it demonstrates quite neatly that, you know, it is an ever ongoing kind of battle between vendors trying to improve their security and making progress in that regard, and then hackers trying to sort of change the nature of what they're doing to try and get around things. What that means for us, of course, is that we do need to spend a certain amount of time keeping up with what the latest protections are and then making sure that they're implemented. So we do see, for example, new features in multi-factor authentication, new capabilities to help ensure that these fatigue attacks can't be successful. So, for example, application validation, not just displaying to a user that someone's trying to log in, but displaying to the user on their phone a prompt that includes the application that a user is logging in from. Maybe it's through a browser, maybe it's through a client application, so that there's more information there that the user can see whether or not that makes sense. You know, are they trying to log in right now? Is it an application that they're even using? It gives them a bit more of a chance to say, well, hang on, that's not right, reject, you know, decline that prompt. Geographical validation, maybe displaying to the user some information about where this login attempt is coming from, so that again they can verify whether or not this login attempt that they're being asked to accept, does it make sense? And then finally, things like number matching. So rather than it just being an accept or decline button, that they actually have to action something that they could only possibly action if it was them trying to log in. And these are the kind of capabilities that are being brought to bear. So for example, you might see something like this. Rather than a standard deny or approve box, you now start to see some information about the app that a user is logging in from, where the login attempt is happening, including a little map. And then you might have, for example, a requirement to put in the number matching. So in this example here, the user has to type in the number 88 and then press yes. They can't just press approve. They actually have to type something in. So that digit would be displayed to them on the screen. If they were logging in, they would see the number and be able to type it in. But if it wasn't them, if it was a hacker, they're obviously not going to have the number. They're not going to be able to just press the accept button and then result in the hacker getting in. So we're putting in place these additional challenges that for the end user take seconds, but for a hacker, it prevents them getting in. Now, of course, with multi-factor authentication, fatigue is not just a fatigue attack. It is also something that sometimes manifests itself in users just not wanting to do this. Maybe they don't want to put this on their personal phone. Maybe there are people inside the organization who say, no, this is too much. I don't want to deploy this. But this now is starting to become, as mentioned, this is the standard locking the front door when you leave. And many people will argue now that realistically, if you're not doing this, you're not just leaving the door unlocked, you're leaving it wide open, visibly on display, just inviting people in. Multi-factor authentication is just a must-have. It's an essential. Now, if you aren't able to implement for every user inside your organization, there are other solutions that you might want to look towards. For example, sort of smart cards or smart tokens, FIDO2 keys. There are various solutions that you can put in place that are not reliant on a prompt coming through to a user's phone. Those solutions will require some investment. You will have to buy the smart cards or buy the keys that you can use in order to implement this additional layer of security rather than using a prompt on your phone. But again, these are the things that we would now consider to be the essential element of just locking the door and making sure that you're not making it easy for hackers. Now, many of these new features that we're looking at coming through are not on by default. So this isn't just going to just happen. You do need to turn them on. So for example, in solutions like Azure Active Directory, this is where we're seeing some of these capabilities being implemented now. You can turn these on, but they're not on by default. You need to sort of roll them out. Microsoft's view of this is that you do need to sort of make sure that your users are told what's happening and what's changing. So they leave it to you to test this proof of concept or pilot it, roll out the relevant notifications to users to say, hey, we're changing the way we do multi-factor, and then you turn it on when you're ready. But it is down to you to turn them on. So these are features that you'll need to look towards to roll out in your organization and make sure you have those security features. Now that's identity management. We need to also think about device management. Again, Dave hinted at this when he was looking at those surveys and those assessments of, wanting to make sure that the devices that people are using are secure, and that if we have a mechanism in place to determine any devices that are not secure, that we can quarantine them or lock them out until remedial action is taken to figure out what the problem is. So these are the kind of capabilities that we want to think about. We want to make sure that, of course, all of our devices, all of our PCs are fully enrolled. So for example, if you're using Microsoft 365 and you've got Azure Active Directory Premium and Microsoft Intune, you can enroll your devices into those solutions so that they're joined to Azure AD in the cloud and that you've got management through your Microsoft Intune Endpoint Manager solution. It gives you those kind of capabilities. Don't forget about your smartphones. You can enroll and fully manage iOS and Android in Microsoft Intune Endpoint Manager as well, so that we can be rolling out configuration profiles to all of these devices and validating their security, that we can do the policies to verify that these devices are secure. So that gives you that ongoing security validation. This is going way beyond simply having an antivirus agent on a device and having a console somewhere that's telling you whether that is working or not. This is actually exploiting the fact that most modern operating systems now have their own security attestation features built in. So if you think about Windows, for example, you've got the Windows Security Center. It's not just validating that your antivirus is secure, it's validating all sorts of things. It's validating whether the firewall's running, it's validating the patch management status, it's validating whether the disk encryption is on. And it's able to do that regardless of whether you're using Microsoft's security features to deliver those capabilities or third party. If you've chosen a different antivirus agent, that's fine. Windows Security Center will count that as valid antivirus running on the machine. If you've got some other form of disk encryption running on the device and you're not using BitLocker, that's fine. Windows will register the fact that the disk is encrypted, so that when Intune comes along and queries the device to check whether it's secure, if you are using third-party solutions, that's fine. It will see that device has those security features in place. And if you've got a compliance policy in place to validate that, it will pass and it will be flagged as compliant. And that's what we're looking for, to flag whether the device is compliant with our policies or not. And if it isn't compliant, then we can have conditional access policies in place inside solutions like Azure Active Directory that define that we want to quarantine or reject access to any user that's trying to log in and access applications and data from a non-compliant device. That gives us the opportunity to close the risk gap automatically. It's not a case of waiting for a user to see an alert in a console and then close down that device and say, oh, we need to investigate that. It's quarantined automatically, and then we can investigate what the problem is. It might simply be that one of the security agents on the device has stopped working, in which case, yes, it's an inconvenience, but we've closed the risk gap, because the risk under those circumstances that something might have actually happened, it might actually be a breach on that device. We can investigate that, figure out what the problem is, clean that device and get it back into operation, and we've reduced the risk profile. Again, one of the problems that we've sort of hinted at a little bit today, but it's can't overstate the importance of this, is that a device being compromised, it's not just that device. It's the question of whether the hacker can say, right, well, I've got in now. Can I use this as a springboard to get to more? That is generally what they will be seeking to do. More could be anything. It could be gaining access to other systems inside your environment. It could be spreading ransomware. It could be just sniffing around to see what they can learn about your organization, the better to launch a phishing campaign against you. There's all sorts of different things that they can do. But once they're in, they can get a springboard for more. Quarantining and locking that down is one of the ways that we can help prevent someone from hopping into one system and then hopping to the next and the next and the next. Don't forget about bring your own device. Now, the easiest thing in the world is to simply say, you know, we're just not going to do BYOD. It's not secure, right? Why would we allow people from their personal devices to gain access to corporate data? But thanks to modern solutions, again, baked into the operating systems, we can deliver secure bring your own device. This is kind of a baked in capability now. You're not bolting it on from third-party solutions. You're able to take advantage of capabilities that are built in to Windows, to iOS, to Android to deliver secure bring your own device. And this is enabled with robust MDM solutions such as Intune and Endpoint Manager from Microsoft. So you can register Windows with Azure AD and Intune. It's not a full cloud join, but it does mean that you can do that same security validation. You can verify that the security status of that device is compliant with your policies. Obviously, in this scenario, you're not the ones rolling out an antivirus agent onto the PC. You're not the one rolling out a firewall configuration or pushing down something like a BitLocker profile. It's down to the end user. It's their PC. They've got to make sure that their antivirus is working. So in most circumstances these days with things like Windows 10 or Windows 11, you're at least going to have Windows Defender available to you, the Microsoft Firewall, Microsoft BitLocker. So for most people, their PC probably will be compliant. The antivirus is working, everything's functioning. But if for any reason it wasn't, you've got a mechanism there to lock it out. Because again, we can say, well, we'll allow BYOD, but only from devices that do meet compliance. So the device has to be registered in order to give you that compliance. And that will work the same way across other platforms like iOS and Android, where you can do the same security validation to say, well, we may not be the ones pushing down security configurations, but if it meets our policies, then we can consider that to be secure. And we've got some security validation going on there so that we know the device being used to log in is secure. And if for any reason it isn't, then it doesn't get in. And the user's privacy is respected under these circumstances as well. They may be registering the device against Azure AD, but we're not able to see the contents of their device. If it's their smartphone, we can't see their data, their personal information. So it provides the privacy protections for them, and it provides the security for you. So if you need to roll out these kind of BYOD solutions, then you can do it securely. You just want to make sure that it's set up in the correct way to exploit those capabilities that are built into the operating system. A final piece of the puzzle that I'm going to touch upon today is data protection, your data itself. This is one of your key digital assets, your data, and there are various different reasons why you want to make sure that you are keeping that safe. Maybe you are in a particular industry, legal, healthcare, finance. There might be certain compliance policies that you need to meet here in order to make sure that your data is kept safe and protected. But even if you're not one of these industries, you might have intellectual property that you need to look after, either yours or intellectual property that's being shared with you by suppliers, partners, customers who expect you to keep that data safe. Or even things like GDPR. If you're storing personally identifiable information, you have an obligation there in law to make sure that that data is kept safe and protected. So there are all sorts of reasons why we want to keep our data safe, but permissions might not be enough. This is the sort of thing that we're familiar with when we're working with, say, files in a file share or stored in a document library. We can set permissions, but any user that has access to that data can do with it whatever they want. They can share it, they can send it, they can upload it to the cloud. You've got to think about, where is your data? The question of where it is, well, yes, it is on your corporate file shares or your corporate document libraries, but it can also be dragged down to a user's desktop. It could be synchronized using a sync tool. From there, it could be uploaded to the personal cloud. It could be dragged onto a USB pen drive. There are all sorts of different locations where your data is being stored. And of course, we expose ourselves here to human error and other risks, the risks of a user keeping hold of data when they leave, the risks of a user sending data to somebody. So there's all sorts of different things that we need to think about here in order to protect our data. A couple of different levels of solution that I'm going to talk about. First of all, technical solutions, things that can be done purely by IT, things that can just be implemented at a technical level to provide additional protections around data security, things that we can do in the operating system, rules that can be implemented, deployed by, again, something like an MDM solution like Intune, Endpoint Manager, to enable certain rules in the operating system so that Windows, for example, will know when data is coming from one of your corporate locations and will automatically encrypt and protect that data and put some rules in place to do things like stop uploads to untrusted locations. So now a user is more than allowed to drag a file down to their desktop. But if they then try and upload it to something like a Dropbox or a Box or a Mega, they'll be prevented from doing that. They just won't be allowed to do it. They can transfer data to external storage, such as a USB pen drive, but the encryption will be maintained so that if that USB pen drive were to find its way into the hands of an unauthorized user, that user wouldn't be able to open the data. And similarly, if the user keeps that USB pen drive after they leave the business, for example, well, their encryption key will be revoked by virtue of you deleting or deactivating their user account. So again, they'll lose access to the data. The same thing can be done through bring your own device as well. If you are allowing users to access data from a BYOD device, you can enable these same capabilities for those users as well. So again, this is another function that allows you to deliver bring your own device, but in a secure manner by ensuring that the data that people are accessing on those personal devices is kept encrypted, kept secure, kept subject to rules. Now, I have many customers who talk to me about various different solutions that they want to put in place to try and prevent people mishandling data. They'll ask me to disable the USB ports for external storage. They'll ask me to put rules in place that block access to certain untrusted locations like Dropbox and other storage locations. What people are actually asking me to do there is to safeguard the data. But actually, if we're doing that through a series of patchwork processes, we are more likely to end up in a situation where things get missed. Let's say you, for example, you're using web controls to block various personal cloud storage locations. Well, what if you miss one? You're ensuring you're relying on making sure that every single potential place that a user might upload data to is in some way blocked. That's quite difficult to do. But if you've got something baked into the operating system that says universally there are only certain places that we are allowed to upload data to, and that is our trusted corporate locations, and anything else is blocked, well, now you've got a slightly more secure, more foolproof method to make sure that the data is secure. But what if we want to go further? What if we want to make sure that in absolutely every scenario, anything that contains sensitive data is secure wherever it goes? Well, this is where we might want to start putting in place things like file level encryption and flagging of data to protect that data wherever it goes. So it doesn't matter how it gets there, whether it's traveling via email, whether it's by a person pressing the share button in a cloud storage site like SharePoint, whether it's a person putting it on a USB pen drive, that the data is secure wherever it goes. And if it lands with someone that shouldn't have access, they won't have access. It'll be blocked. Even if someone's just attached a file to an email and pressed the send button and they've accidentally sent it to the wrong person, no problem. If it's encrypted, if it's protected with the rules, it will travel. That security sticks to the file like glue. Unlike permissions that only stick to the file as long as it's stored in its trusted location, but then don't apply when the user downloads it. Well, now we've got solutions that we can put in place that protect the file wherever it goes. We can implement this through data labeling policies that ensure that a user can take an existing file or create a new file and they can label the file as sensitive. Now, this requires a certain amount of policy crafting, that you've got to think about this as a whole business strategy. What are your policies? What are the sensitive data types that you handle? If a user creates a new file or a new document that's got sensitive data, are they thinking about making sure that they're labeling it with the right sensitivity label so that the right security and the right rules apply? There are automation tools available to us in this sphere that allow us to detect data But it's an interplay. It's an interplay of the human knowing their obligations to label the data properly and the technology that might recommend the right label to apply. So if it detects certain types of data in a file that you're creating, it'll say, hey, you should label this file thusly, and the user can press yes or okay or choose the right label accordingly. But it is an interplay of policy and technology and implementation. So it's a whole business strategy. There's going to be some user training. It takes a little bit longer to implement these solutions, but if that's the industry that you're in and you have certain compliance policies that you're trying to meet or certain laws that you need to comply with, this may be the kind of solution that you need to go through. Now, ProBrand can provide a variety of services to help in this regard. We can help with things like security reviews to look at various different areas where you might need to improve or extend your security. And that can include doing things like Cyber Essentials reviews. If you're looking to get your Cyber Essentials or Cyber Essentials Plus certification, ProBrand can help by providing services in this arena. We can also provide solutions that can implement some of the capabilities that we've touched upon today, as well as others. For example, if you're looking for managed services to look after things like firewall, antivirus, patch management, so that you don't have to deal with any of that management yourself, if you've not got your own internal security team that can be monitoring that on a regular basis, ProBrand can provide managed services to deliver in that regard. Just as a quick recap, we touched upon this in the other two webinars, but for any of you who weren't there, ProBrand also have a billing platform for Microsoft's cloud services. So that if you're looking to get your licensing through a monthly invoice rather than getting the company credit card out, ProBrand can provide that. We've got a full catalog of services for things like Microsoft 365, individual components like SharePoint, Exchange Online, etc., Dynamics, Power BI. We can even provide your Azure subscription. It's not just seat-based services, it's your consumption-based services like Microsoft Azure. You can have that through a monthly invoice from ProBrand as well. Our billing platform has a range of different advantages, a full catalog of Microsoft Cloud services, as mentioned, including some that you can't actually get direct from Microsoft that are only available through partners like ProBrand. It's linked to your backend and your tenancy so that any new licenses that are provisioned are available in your tenancy in a matter of minutes. So you've got new licenses that you need to provision for new starters, very quick and easy to do. You can mix and match monthly and annual licenses in the same tenancy. So if you've got seasonal workers where you just need to pay for a few months and then spin them down once they've been offboarded, you can do that too. Perpetual licenses are available inside the platform. You need to grab a SQL license, for example, it's all there. Self-service access is available to this platform. So if you would prefer to be able to just add your own licenses, that's something you like about being able to go direct to Microsoft, you can have that same experience through ProBrand. Log into the portal, add the new licenses that you need, hop over to your Microsoft Admin Center, and as mentioned, because we're linked to Microsoft's backend and your tenancy, those licenses will just appear available for you to use. No need to wait for an order to process. If you would prefer to work with an account manager and have them be instructed as to set up new licenses for you, you can do that too. The choice is yours. We're completely flexible in this regard. Full billing reports are available in the portal, so you can go back and look at your billing profile for any given month previously with all those historical reports. For Azure as well, we've got a great Power BI report that extracts all of the data from Microsoft Azure so that it provides you with full transparency into your monthly spend, both for previous months and for the current live month as well, all broken down by the various resources that you have provisioned. And this is all available at no extra cost. There's no fees for this billing platform. And when we say no extra cost, we mean it. We don't pad our license costs. We've got no hidden fees in that regard. It is no hidden cost in that regard. That brings me to the end of my presentation and slide deck for today. So that's now going to bring us to the Q&A stage. So thank you very much for your time. I'm going to hand back to Nicole.
Thank you very much, Mark and Dave, for those excellent presentations. So to our webinar guests, I hope that the presentation gave you some insight into the top digital defence solutions to explore and implement. So we'll now skip to Q&A. And I'll just ask my colleague Lindsay, have we had any questions through?
Hi there. Just one question so far. Please do pop them in the Q&A tab at the top of your screen if you have any. The question that we've got at the moment is, how do we get started with security in Azure?
Cool, fantastic. Mark, who's going first?
I can jump in. I mean,
yeah,
it can be a bit of a daunting prospect, particularly if you don't have your own cybersecurity specialist internally. You don't have the benefit of a SecOps team or your own security operations center. If you're not in that position of having those kind of specialists, and of course, for many of our small business customers, they're lucky if they have their own IT manager, let alone a team. So it's something where not everyone's going to have these kind of specialisms in house. Obviously, this is one of the areas where ProBrand can help out in terms of helping you get started. And a couple of things I would say: if you're not sure where to start the journey, a good place to start is things like Cyber Essentials, because that's a standard, that's a framework specifically built for small business organizations where you're not quite ready to go for something like ISO 27001. You're not going up to that level yet. You're just looking to get started and get the standards of some sort of cybersecurity framework in place for your organization. Cyber Essentials can be a good place to start because it's going to review your IT. We've got a accredited Cyber Essentials practitioner internally here at ProBrand who can work through all of this with you and get you on your journey and get things started. That can be a good starting point. Start with a standard, start with a framework that you can kind of measure up against, meet that standard, implement the necessary changes that you need to implement in order to achieve that security standard, and then you've got that security. And that does two things. First of all, it's going to give you a certain level of assurance that you've covered those basics and you've got that standard in place. And it mentions that, and it gives you that capability where you can say, well, I can display that badge. I've got that certification. It's a badge that you can display to show to other organizations that you've taken some steps to make sure that your cybersecurity is covered. The second thing that I would say is that especially for certain industries, I mentioned it there in terms of things like data protection, that there can be certain industries like legal and healthcare, finance, where you might be working with certain types of data that might require you to take some steps in order to meet some standards that you are obligated to comply with. You might be handling data where there are laws that apply. If you're handling personally identifiable information, for example, GDPR, it can sometimes be useful to get the perspective not just of an IT or a cybersecurity specialist, but to get the perspectives of a data protection officer, for example. Now, again, you might not have a data protection officer inside your organization, but you can approach other organizations who work in this sphere and can give you the perspective of saying, well, here are the laws, here are the regulations, here are the things that will apply to you. You're handling this data. You really need to meet this standard, otherwise you might be leaving yourself open. Now, that will probably still map back to some technologies that you will need to implement, but getting that additional perspective from someone who comes at it from a different angle is going to give you some pointers as to where you need to focus your efforts, where you're going to need to make the investment in order to make sure that your security is up to scratch and is going to help you meet your obligations as a business.
It's really comprehensive, Mark. I don't think there's anything I'd add to that, to be honest. Other than thanks everybody for jumping in. I've really enjoyed these three sessions, so I hope it's been useful, and yeah, look forward to seeing what comes through off the back of it.
Just one more question has come in, just before we finish up. We've had one more question. You touched on quarantine of compromised devices. Can you expand on this in terms of best practice?
I'd probably take that. I don't know about you, Mark, but from my point of view, because it's more that kind of branches into the EMS side of thing, device management, I'd probably either defer or take that offline. I don't know. You got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, depends on that. Go on. Yeah, I mean, there's one or two areas where you'll want to think about. I mean, this branches a little bit slightly between corporate-owned devices and bring your own device, that you might want to think slightly differently about the different types of devices that you have in your organization. You're aiming, ideally, to be in a situation where you would consider your corporate-owned devices to be more trustable because you're in more control of those devices. You're able to set profiles, you're able to push security configurations down to those devices more comprehensively than you will with bring your own device, where you are just reliant on, to a certain extent, the end user. You're relying on the security capabilities that they have on their device just working. But either way, you can set compliance policies. So in the world of Intune and in most management solutions, it would call it, a compliance policy. You're crafting a bunch of compliance policies here that are going to verify the status of the device. And you can build quite a lot into these compliance policies. There are certain things that you would certainly consider the basics. Is the antivirus working on the device? Yes or no? No is bad. So that might be enough to flag the device is not compliant. Then there's going to be things like, is the firewall working? Is disk encryption turned on? Is the device up to date? You might block out devices that are running older operating systems. And these days, that includes older builds of operating systems. So you think about Windows 10, for example, that's been in play for quite a number of years now, but has had various new builds of the operating system pushed out. And certain of the older builds are no longer supported. You know, Windows 10 as a whole is still supported, but the older builds are considered to be not supported anymore. You might say, well, okay, well, we don't want the older builds being used. If someone's trying to register a BYOD PC and it's got an older build of Windows, they've not allowed their computer to update for some reason. Well, again, you might say, nope, keeping that out. Similar kind of story in terms of, you look at operating systems like iOS and Android, where they are given a new version number each time it's updated, maybe once a year or whatever, but it's still very much a fairly rapid rollout of releases of the operating system. You might want to prevent older operating systems from being accessing the environment. One of the bigger questions that sometimes, I guess, is coming through is, if a device does get detected as non-compliant, how much wiggle room to give? Do you mark that as non-compliant straight away and immediately lock it out? Or do you give a grace period and say, no, we'll allow a certain period of time of 1 or 2 days or whatever for this device to be remediated, especially if we're putting the responsibility on the end user to remediate? This, I guess, comes down to a little bit of a risk assessment approach with cybersecurity. And again, it might come down to the type of data that the user is going to have access to, the kind of systems that they're going to have access to. If it's someone that's got more access to sensitive data inside your organization, you might be more aggressive with that. You might be saying, I want to take a more aggressive approach because this person's got access to sensitive data, data that if it gets exposed externally can be a serious problem for us. We want to make sure that, if there's a problem on their machine, that gets locked down. You can be quite granular if you need to be about who these compliance policies apply to, which groups. You can be granular across the organization. So I appreciate that it can be that's a little bit of a frustrating "it depends" type answer, but it will vary a little bit depending on your organization, who we're talking about, what kind of data they have access to, and making a few decisions around what our risk assessment around that is going to be. So I appreciate that. That's probably a little bit of an "it depends" answer, and would probably require a bit more of an offline discussion around your organization, what you do, what your kind of concerns might be in some of these areas, to make a bit of a risk assessment on that. But these are some of the things that you can do and some of the considerations that will factor into that thinking.
Great, thank you. That's all for the questions.
Thank you very much. I'll just share the feedback form with everybody. It's hopefully everyone can see it on their screen. This is the link has been shared in the chat. I'll also share the link with you in a follow-up email, which will contain the recording. Can everybody see that feedback form?
I've got it, yeah.
Okay, lovely. Just wanted to check. So within the feedback form, you can claim a couple of free offers that we're offering here: a free cloud review, a proof of concept, and some Azure consumption to the value of £1,200. If you want to explore those offers further, please just indicate on the feedback form and submit it, and that will come through to me. Just a couple of questions about what you found of most interest during the webinar, and if you're likely to attend another webinar or recommend one of our webinars. So it'll only take a couple of minutes, and so if you've got the time, I really would appreciate you completing that. So I think that just about kind of draws the event to a close. So many thanks to Mark and Dave for your presentations today. They were excellent, and thank you everybody for attending. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Pleasure. Hopefully speak to some of you soon. Take care.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.